So I thought tonight we could talk about the gift of suffering. Normally, suffering isn't considered a gift, so I hope no one's too offended before we even start here. But I'd like to make the distinction between pain and suffering. Normally, we don't distinguish between those two words. Often they're almost hyphenated, pain and suffering. I think it may even be a legal term. It's how common those two words go together. And pain is often unavoidable, right? So pain can be anything that just hurts, right? I mean, we can slam our fingers in the car door and it hurts. You know, we can break up in a relationship or a friendship, and that can be quite painful, right? Can, you know, at some point in our lives, we may develop an illness that can become, you know, where the pain is just intense. At some point in our life, we may lose a parent or a sibling. You know, the grief is painful. So these are just examples of things that are difficult in this lifetime. You know, I imagine by now no one believes that life is always just a bowl of cherries. I mean, there are difficult things that happen. And we're not denying that. We're not trying to whitewash that. We're not trying to say, well, you know, it's okay. No, it hurts. It's painful. You know, so we can acknowledge that things happen in this lifetime that are difficult, that do hurt. You know, and we can argue, well, you know, life shouldn't be that way. You know, we shouldn't have to deal with these painful events in our life. You know, maybe there's, you know, some flaw in creation that causes these difficult things to happen. But the truth is that they do happen, right? And I'd argue that it's not even a mistake. It's as it should be. But this is different than suffering. Painful events may be unavoidable. Suffering is different. Suffering is what we tell ourselves about the painful events. Right? It's what we tell ourselves about, you know, what happened last week or last year or 20 years ago that we haven't quite resolved in our mind, and we keep bringing it up into current memory and replaying it and finding some sort of self-justification or assigning blame or you know, being judgmental about what somebody else did or didn't do. Or it could be something about the future, about how you know, we're anticipating some misfortune in the future or the possibility of it. And often that thinking process about a past event or a future event, which is all we can ever think about, we can't actually think about the current moment. It's always either about the past or the future. And so that thinking process is what amplifies whatever event has happened or we imagine will happen. You know, and when we think about it, we can notice that there's an association between thinking and how the body is feeling. There's a connection, an intimate connection between thought and emotion. And when we really look deeply at it, we can see that beneath emotions, there is a thought that is believed. Right? So there can be a thought. Thoughts pass through our mind all the time. Right? In that way, they're quite impersonal. They're just happening. But some thoughts um, we sort of grasp onto and make it part of ourselves. And we do that through the power of belief, right? So the thought itself may be impersonal in that it's just occurring. But when we endow that thought with the power of our belief, then it becomes my thought. This is what I believe. So it feels, at that point, it feels very personal. And when it's personal, then it becomes an opinion, right? Becomes my, I'm quite sure that this is how the other person should be or should have been, how life should be, how I should be. We become quite confident in our opinions because of the power of belief in thought, right? So when we start looking at the negative emotions that cause suffering or are, what we label as suffering, this sort of constellation of negative emotions, and we call that suffering. But that's founded on our belief on a thought or a group of thoughts that we take to be true. If we don't believe the thought, it doesn't have any power. So the only way we can actually suffer is when we believe a thought, right? That's the power of it, right? So the pain is unavoidable, but the suffering, the stories that we tell ourselves that we believe are true or might be true, or that we're afraid could be true, those kind of stories, when we believe those, they amp up the emotions, right? When we get a good storyline going, it can, we can feel it in the body. And when we feel it in the body, we feel like, well, then that's true. I can feel it. And then that amplifies the thought process about it. We add, sort of flesh out the storyline about how the person really was wrong. And not only that, but, and we can come up with 10 other reasons, and then we get a really solid storyline going. And then that has an effect to the body. The body gets even more invigorated here with, anger or guilt or jealousy or whatever the emotion is. And we have this cyclical process where emotion feeds the thought and the thought feeds the emotion. And we can build up a really solid head of steam about it, right? But it's all founded on a belief thought. Without the belief thought, that cycle never gets off the ground. There's just no energy there for it. So when we talk about the gift of suffering, it's really that the suffering is always a pointer towards a belief thought. So sometimes when we're caught up in the emotion, we're so certain that we're right that, we know who's to blame. We know what should have happened. We know our anger is justified. When we're caught up in that, we can convince ourselves that that's actually true, right? The more we're convinced that it's true, the more solidity that it has. It's the power of it. And what holds it in place is that it may be partially true. It's 50%, maybe it's 75%, maybe it's 10%, who knows? But it's never completely true. So how can we say that it's never completely true so categorically? Because no thought is completely true. Some thoughts are relatively true. I mean, you could say that, it's beneficial to your health to exercise. Okay, that's relatively true. But is it always true under all circumstances for all people at all times? No. I mean, sometimes it's more beneficial to rest. Day off your fractured ankle for a week or two. So a lot of things can be relatively true, but not ultimately true. And the reason that we can say that no thought is ultimately true, and we've talked about this many times before, but any thought is composed of words, right? The string of words in our head, one after another, very linear fashion, those thoughts are all composed of words. And each word is a label, right? A label for something that's more real. It's much like, you look in a file drawer when people used to have like file cabinets and file folders, and on the file folder, there'd be the name of what the folder contained. But what was actually important was inside the folder, not the name of it. So all words are like the name referring to something, but not actually reality of it. It's much like, if you go into the restaurant, the menu references something real, the meal, right? Wouldn't be nourishing, right? The reality isn't in the menu. The menu just refers to what is more fundamentally true, which is the meal that you hope to be served. So all words are like that. No word, however, no word or group of words or phrases or paragraphs or philosophies or dogmas or beliefs, none of it is ultimately true. Again, it might be relatively true, but not ultimately true, simply because no concept about life can encompass the entirety of life. Life is more vast than any concept about it. So any attempt in our own mind to reduce the reality of any situation to a belief about it or our summary judgment of it will not be entirely accurate. So if we can really see that, we can just cease looking towards our thoughts to determine what's real, what's true. And we can see the relationship between thoughts that are believed, especially thoughts about other people and, self-judgments and opinions about the world or how everything else should be, all those kinds of thoughts. Depending on how fervently we believe those thoughts is directly related to how much we suffer. So when we argue with how the world is unfolding, right? And it's always doing that. It's always changing. It's part of the dynamic quality of life, how life unfolds, always changing. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is forever. Everything in the world of form is always in a state of flux. So when we argue with how that's unfolding, we have life in one corner, and in the other corner, we have my opinion about how it should be. And when we argue with how life is unfolding, we suffer. And we suffer as long as we hold on to that argument. Arguments founded on what I believe is true. Right? So as long as we hold on to that argument, we will suffer. The only question is how much and how. And we have a choice. We always have a choice. We can choose um, to believe that thought stream in our head and suffer, or not. You know, choosing not to suffer, but holding on to the thought stream doesn't work. We've tried it. You know, it just doesn't work. You know, because that's just dealing with the symptom. The suffering is actually the symptom. The cause is the believed thought, right? So in this country, I mean, we're, you know, in the medical profession, we're, you know, and how we relate to it, we're all used to dealing with the symptoms. You know, we have a headache, we want the headache to go away. Give me a pill, make the headache go away. You know, we don't really care about what caused the headache in the first place. As long as I can get rid of it, even temporarily, I'm good. Find out that we have, you know, our arteries are clogged up, and the solution is to, you know, fix them, you know, sew in new ones or put a stent in. And, you know, rarely is the question asked like, well, why are they clogged in the first place? We don't care about that so much. We just want the symptoms to go away. You know, so we're very used to thinking about things that make me uncomfortable. The solution is just, well, you know, just get rid of my discomfort and I'm good. You know, but rarely do we ask, well, what's the root cause of that discomfort? And I'd suggest that when we're talking about suffering, suffering is not the cause. Suffering is the symptom of something deeper. That something deeper is a believed thought that creates feelings. And those feelings, you know, most of us are familiar with. We sort of put them under the heading of suffering, but they're, you know, things like, you know, what holding on to blame feels like, or self-justification, or despondency, or guilt, or judgment. Holding on to those kinds of feelings, what the energetic imprint of those feel like, and then we just put it under the, you know, the general heading of suffering. That's what it actually feels like. But we can look at all of those and see the connection, not the connection, but the actual cause of that feeling when we trace it back is a believed thought. Believed thought is in opposition to what the facts of the matter are. Somebody said something, okay, that's what happens, right? What we tell ourselves about what the person said, that's often what causes much more suffering than the original statement. And we can keep it alive for years, right? And hold a grudge for I mean, the Hatfields and McCoys held on to it for generations. We can do the same for even over the course of a whole lifetime. If we try to deal with it at the level of symptom, it never quite works, right? For example, if I think, well, it would be much more spiritual of me to forgive this person. So that's what I'll try to do. We're just dealing with it at the level of symptom, right? But deep down, we feel like, yeah, but they were wrong. They really were to blame. But I'm generous enough, so I'll forgive them. So we're just dealing with it at the level of symptom. But if we really look more deeply and see that whatever the person did, they did. That's how life was unfolding in that moment. We can come up with all kinds of reasons why they shouldn't have done that, but that's what happened. As a result of all the experiences and conditions and circumstances in that person's life, in that moment, they acted in that way. If we can really see that, where's the blame? If we can see that there's no personal blame involved, what are we holding on to? But we feel like somehow it's our responsibility to not let this other person off the hook. So as long as we feel that way on a deeper level, as long as we hold that underlying belief, any attempts to be forgiving will just be superficial, right? We can have, we can try to be accepting of other people's, let's say, religious beliefs. But if deep down we feel like, yeah, it's because of the superiority of my religious beliefs that I'm allowed to accept even their really inferior religious beliefs. If that's the underlying thought, you know, how sincere is our acceptance of the other person's beliefs? So if we're trying to resolve something just on a symptom level, superficial level, um, it doesn't really carry much weight in the long term. But if we can get to the underlying thought that we take to be true, in the case of the latest example I used there, we can see that all beliefs can only be relatively true, but no belief is ultimately true. If we can actually get to that understanding and why that's true, rather than just adopting it as another belief, um, then where's the superiority? So, so we can really look at that and see the direct connection between thought, which only has power when it's believed, and see that connection of a believed thought to our internal environment, our internal feelings. And then when we believe thoughts that are not actually true, and those negative feelings arise in the body, we can see that connection. We can trace it back to that believed thought and just checking to see whether that's actually true or not. Really true, not partially true. But all of this that we're talking about has very much to do with how we identify ourselves. Because this sense of believing a thought is very personal, right? It's what I believe. And why do I believe it? Because that's how I see the world. That's how I've determined how I can decide what's beneficial for me, what things I like, what things I agree with, how things should be. So we can see this is a very sort of egocentric way to look at the world. You know, this sense of my beliefs, my opinions. But if we can see that it's precisely that sense of how we identify ourselves as separate from, well, everybody else. I'm separate because I believe I have these beliefs. I'm quite certain of them. You know, I believe this is how the world should work, how other people should be. So holding those beliefs tightly actually creates the sense of separation. And then we get into spirituality and wonder, well, how can I sense into the unity of all things? If we're trying to sense into the unity of all things from the assumption that what I am is separate, how do I go from the sense of separate from to the sense of being at home in existence? And I'd suggest the sense of being at home in existence is our natural state. It's not, it's not a distant attainment. It's something that is present, obvious, unavoidable. As soon as we stop convincing ourselves that separate, and we do that by being identified with our beliefs and opinions. That's what holds us separate. I know how life should work. I'm quite certain of it. So we can just feel that contraction, pulling us apart from life, being in judgment of life, being quite sure of our own thoughts about life. And then we suffer. So this is the gift of suffering. Really, suffering is it's like the indicator light on your dashboard. It's we can take it as a pointer, as indicative of something that requires attention. And it's just like the light on your dashboard. I mean, you can ignore that, but you can ignore it at your own misfortune, right? In this case, we can ignore the mechanism of suffering, but the pain of it is that we go on suffering. And life is generous that way. Right? Life will continue to offer suffering. Not that it's being mean or intentional or anything. It's just the natural consequences of believing thoughts that aren't actually true. We suffer, and then we believe thoughts that aren't true, and then we suffer. That's the generosity of life. It doesn't let us off the hook. It's quite insistent that way. So we can take this suffering as a flaw in creation, or we can take it as life's doing everything that it possibly can to point us towards something that is far more true than the believed thoughts in our heads. That's the gift of it. When we suffer, it's always a pointer back to something that we're believing that isn't true. So we can take it that way when the sense of suffering, rather than trying to deal with it as a symptom, like just make it go away. I just want to feel better. Take it as a hint, as a gift to look at thought that's being believed. That's not true. So it's always pointing back to that. We tend to ignore that and just worry about how to feel better or how to feel justified or how the other person's really to blame and I'm blameless. And so we can just see that mechanism, but and be willing to look at the underlying thought that's creating those emotions. So the body's very good at that. The body's very good at informing us. Um, Often we ignore it, but if we don't, it can be very helpful to um, tell us when we need to be looking at or for some thought that's being believed. We may not even know immediately what that thought is, but at least the suffering will cause us, hopefully, to look for what's there, what thought is being believed. So that's the gift of it. And what we can discover is that the awareness that we pointed to at the beginning is where the freedom lies. Because the awareness is present for everything, fully participating in everything already. It's already doing that. But because it's not of the world of form, it is not subject to harm. Because it's not subject to harm, it frees us to participate in the world. It's really the difference of, if you went to a movie theater, and there was a Western playing, it's the difference between being in the audience and watching the gunfight on the street and being the character in the movie in the gunfight. That's the difference. When we're seeing it, we can participate in it, but as an observer, knowing we truly are is beyond harm. And that's what can be found in the recognition of our essential being as this awareness. That's where the freedom lies. But if we get caught in trying to resolve the suffering at the level of suffering, there's no end to it. So my suggestion is just recognize what the believed thought is, see that is happening within the greater field of awareness, and not go to war with the thought, right? Just see it. Our job is not to change the thought. Our job is to see that it's not actually true. If we see that it's not actually true, it drops away on its own. You don't have to try to make it go away. The resolution to the whole issue of suffering is seeing this connection between a thought believed, a negative emotion, and recognizing that whole emotional entanglement arising from thought only ever happens with awareness. And that awareness is already complete in all of us. And when we can see that and come back to that often, we will recognize that it is our essential nature. We don't have to believe it. We can just keep coming back to it over and over to the point that we can't disbelieve it anymore.